The Sega Genesis is easily one of my favorite game systems ever released. Originally, it landed in the summer of 1989 with me getting mine at Christmas thanks to my hardworking mother. Less than a year after that, I got my very first job that gave me the buying power to explore its library at will by renting games regularly and buying the AAA hits as they arrived. For the next few years, I was treated to some pretty incredible software. It was a great mix of new and established series, many of which couldn't be played on anything else. Of course, like all the great game machines that have ever existed over the years, its time in the spotlight would pass, and it would be replaced by newer and more exciting options. The old Genesis had been a fighter, however. Despite being released in 1989, it got games frequently all the way up until 1996, when things finally slowed down considerably. That year, we still got some really nice software, however. The superbly animated Pocahontas was released, and though Sega wasn't responsible for this Disney property, it still was a pretty decent experience. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 also found its way home that year. The aged Genesis hardware couldn't reproduce the arcade 100%, but you still have to admire the fact that it was still able to produce a very playable version. Midway also released NBA Hang Time on the Genesis, a great port of their arcade basketball series that originally started out as NBA Jam. Once again, the Genesis, despite its age, provided a solid gameplay experience that retained the original 4-player co-op and competitive multiplayer. Sega made sure that there was one final adventure with the Little Blue Blur that year, and we got Sonic 3D Blast by Traveler's Tales. This was an isometric action game that changed just about everything with the series. Some loved it, some hate it, but it definitely left its mark. Virgin teamed up with Disney to bring us Pinocchio, a side-scrolling action game that showed off that the Genesis could still put out some pretty incredible visuals and animation. While the gameplay itself was kinda tame, you just had to respect those graphics. Vector Man made his triumphant return in 1996 as well. Its heavy use of pre-rendered assets was seen as Sega's answer to Donkey Kong Country. It certainly had some great animation and special effects to go along with it. When 1997 rolled around, the Sega Genesis released a slow to a crawl, and less than a dozen games made it out that entire year. In this episode, we will be going over the final days of the Sega Genesis in the North American market. Did it go out with the bang it deserved, or did Sega let it die without so much as a whimper? Keep on watching and find out. Sports had been a big part of the Genesis success story in the United States, so it's no surprise to see NBA Live 98 here. Electronic Arts had a number of games that always sold well for them on the platform, and they made sure to eke out every chance of a profit while they could. With the PlayStation version commanding the attention of their better development teams, this one was dumped off to Tiertex, who basically just updated the previous year's engine. Still, the NBA Live series had some solid gameplay at that point. It was fast, easy to understand, and the animation was actually quite nice. THQ would publish it since Electronic Arts was fully focused on the 32-bit machines at the time. It didn't break any new ground, but it was a solid game if you enjoyed the sport. It was only released in North America. Sega itself wasn't lost on the importance of sports games to the Genesis brand, and they released NFL 98 in 1997. This one was based on the Joe Montana NFL 95 engine that was 3 years old by this point. I guess the old saying that if it isn't broke, don't fix it applies here, because Sega just basically updated the rosters and slung it out the door. It plays well enough for a 16-bit football title, but its history is actually more interesting than the game itself. While the Saturn was the flagship console at the time, NFL 98 would never appear on it, making the Genesis version the final release of the original Joe Montana style of football games. And speaking of Joe Cool, this game was the basis of a nasty lawsuit filed against Sega for $5 million. Montana and his attorneys alleged that Sega had breached a contract to produce a video game together. When Sega released NFL 98, a product produced without Montana's input or likeness, the relationship soured. NFL 98 was also the final football game from Sega before Sega Sports was reborn with the NFL 2K series on the Dreamcast. Sega also only released it in North America.
No!
The relationship between Electronic Arts and THQ continued with a release of the popular hockey series NHL 98. This one again pretty much followed the path that NBA Live 98 took. Keep what was working before, add a few mild tweaks, and update the rosters. It's still fast and plays great, so I suppose I can understand not risking anything on 8-year-old hardware. Still, if you had played the previous few years, there wasn't much here to get excited about. Like a lot of these late sports releases, this was only released in North America. One of the more peculiar releases in the final days of the Genesis was Virtua Fighter 2. Since the base Genesis hardware had no hope of rendering a polygon version of the game, Sega decided to use traditional hand-drawn sprites and backgrounds. As you can probably imagine, this completely changed not just the look of the visuals, but also how it played. It's now a fixed 2D perspective, so you lose the replays as well. Being on a cartridge also meant you got a ton of things cut out of it. You lose both of the new characters that showed up in Virtua Fighter 2, and you lose a ton of moves and sound effects. I really am impressed Sega wanted to do something like this, but I think they should have at least broke out the old SVP chip and really made a more valiant effort. A 3D arena with 2D sprites may have been a much more compelling product. This was never released in Japan despite Virtua Fighter 2 being more popular there than anywhere else in the world. The Japanese Mega Drive had not sold as well as other regions, and its market completely collapsed in 1995.
Ready, go!
Golden Axe 3 here was originally released in a few Asian territories back in 1993. While it never got a physical version in the United States, it did make its way to the Sega Channel in 1997. I was unlucky enough to live out in the middle of nowhere at the time, so I was quite envious of those that had the Sega Channel as an option. Golden Axe 3 is a grossly underappreciated title. The simple graphics really turned people away, but hidden behind that was a robust gameplay system that had a ton of moves, specials, and magic. It was far beyond many of the other 16-bit beat-em-ups in this regard, something many of its critics have no idea about. Seriously, if you have only ever given this one a cursory look, find yourself a moves list and try it again. There is much more here than many give it credit for. Sega also released an update to its baseball franchise, World Series 98. I always felt these games were decent, but Sega didn't change much of anything in its final years. Hell man, you put this beside the 95, 96, and 97 releases and you'll have a hard time telling them apart. The Saturn versions of World Series Baseball were such incredible upgrades, going back to this was actually quite rough. As you'd expect, it was only released in North America.
He drops it over the infield.
Perhaps the greatest gift in those final days was the Appaloosa Interactive developed The Lost World Jurassic Park. Hidden behind this simple overhead action title are some of the most impressive Genesis special effects you'll ever see. Some of this stuff could pass for early Saturn and PlayStation graphics. The core game itself is okay, but those visuals tend to drive you on just to see what's next. I highly advise consulting a guide and get a clear understanding of the gameplay. The overhead sections can bog down quickly, getting you lost and unsure what to do next. This one has kicked up in price big time in the last few years, so if you're curious, try it out on an emulator first, if nothing more than to see those killer visuals. Electronic Arts' last Genesis game was Madden 98, a fitting end to their run since Madden was among one of the first games they released for the platform. Both Tiertex and THQ were involved in this game's creation as well, but it still is mainly a retread of the engine seen from Madden 1997. I actually had preferred the earlier Genesis Madden games to the later ones. While 98 here is fully licensed by the NFL and Players Association, I found the original engine more playable. Still, Madden rode the Genesis train to the very end, and gave 8 years of solid football titles. Aside from being the final Madden on the Genesis, it also happens to be the final Madden game on a Sega platform altogether. Electronic Arts would not develop anything for the Dreamcast, despite Sega playing a pivotal role in their growth as a game maker.
34. Put. Incomplete.
The final Sega Genesis game in North America was Frogger, published by Majesco in 1998. This was a straight port of the original 1981 arcade game. I had been under the impression it would be enhanced, but nope, this is not a re-imaging at all. You may remember Majesco as the company responsible for the Sega Genesis 3 console, a miniature, cheaper version of Sega's own models. Frogger here actually coincided with that release in 1998 under license from Sega and Konami. What can you say about this one? It's a damn fine Golden Era arcade game, no doubt. It plays, looks, and sounds just like it should, making it a great home version of the original. But let's be frank here, this absolutely needed an enhanced mode for the graphics and sound. Maybe a puzzle mode or something with co-op multiplayer. The bare bones presentation and gameplay just didn't cut it in 1998, especially at the $20 asking price. It was only released in North America and also happens to be the final game that was released for the Super Nintendo here as well. The end of a console's life is both a sad and interesting time. While on one hand you tend to get software like rehashed sports franchises, you can also get a few companies taking some chances. While most of what we received during the final days of the Sega Genesis were of the former variety, it was nice to see a game like The Lost World so late in the cycle. Heck, even though Virtua Fighter 2 missed the mark by quite a bit, it was still quite surprising to see Sega take such a risk with hardware so old. I actually recall these last games quite well, as many of them also happen to be among the final North American releases for the Sega Saturn. And that is perhaps the saddest legacy here. While 1997 closed out most of the Sega Genesis market, it also closed out most of the Sega Saturn market in North America. While the Genesis had enjoyed a full life of many impressive games, the poor Saturn had barely been given any time at all, and most of its best games remained locked away in Japan. It was amazing to see Sega go from a nearly unstoppable force in the North American market with the Genesis to utterly and completely crushed just a mere 2 years later. By the time 1998 got underway, not only had the Sega Genesis market disappeared, but so had the Saturns. This left North America without any real Sega presence for nearly 2 years before the Dreamcast showed up. That left many of the hearts and minds of former Sega customers to be easily won over by Nintendo and Sony. Converts that would never ever return again. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.